Tuatahi, rā ka mihi ake ki tō tātua atua, mātua i te rangi. Taurua ki o tātou rahi, kua au atu i te moenga roa. Huri roa ki a tātou e whakarau ika mai nei. Tēnā tātou katoa. E rere kau nā mihi mai oha ki te iwi o te whenua tauriki kura. Tēnā koutou e Ngāti Whātua. Ko whakatau anake te toa i tā maua, whiti rāwa. E nā mana, e nā reo, e manu tuarangi. Nau mai, haere mai i te wiki o te reo Māori. Haere mai runga i te kaupapa e tātoko mai nei. Arā, he whai wānangananga kia puta tātou ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama. Nō reira, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai. Kia ora tātou katoa, ko ingoa lama, ko hāmoa, ko tonga na motu. Ko vaia, ko matāwai, te maunga, ko vai moso lufi. Whasto yuta, pua te kāinga. Ko marama marae o te tūranga waiwai, te lalonga fua te whenga saunga, te malai tia. Ko pesta whamatua inu, tō leawa, te hapu, te tīpuna, ko Samoana, ko Tonga, ko Siamani, te tangata. Nau mai karakia, nau mai e hiwa ki enei pia, marama mai ki runga, marama mai ki raro, kia marama mai te wānanga o roto, tuturu whakamaua ki a tina. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Just before we get underway, we just got some house rules. For those that are unfamiliar with the place, obviously our exits is where we came from. We've got one underneath here. If you need to go to the bathroom facilities, it's just around just around the corner to your right there. And then that's us. Also, we've got quite a good chat today, good discussions coming up. So it might go out to possibly 7:30 for some of you guys that are time conscious. We do have a little bit of a break, a 3-5 minute break after the speakers talk. So before we get underway, I'll just hand that over to Charmaine for our introductions. Thank you, Charmaine.
Thank you, Lama. Nau mai, haere mai, ko Ilaiu Talei toku whānau, ko Charmaine toku ingoa, no Kingdom of Tonga ahau, no Tāmaki Makaurau ahau. Kia ora, malolele. My name is Charmaine Ilaiu Talei. I'm a senior lecturer here at Te Pare School of Architecture and Planning and Associate Dean Pacific at Creative Arts and Industries faculty. Alongside Peseta Lamatone, our newly appointed Assistant Dean Pacific of our faculty, we are very honoured to be convening today's lectures. Over this week, our staff, our students have been enjoying the engagement, the learnings, the reciprocity with our international visiting academics from Te Ao Moemoeā, Australia. Professor Alison Page, Professor Paul Memmott. Nau mai, haere mai, ka pai. Thank you so much for making the time. It's a busy time of the year, and to be here with us in Aotearoa, we're very, very grateful. Many of us in this room have experienced the engagement, the conversations, the talanoa, and I'm sure you've created new friends and new connections now, and we want to keep that going. And so for all of you, I just want to show a few of our highlights, I guess, of this week. All right, so I'm just going to flick through some of these images. So we began on Monday with a mihi whakatau. Awesome. And we had our kaiarahi lead us with Kuki Kingi. And here you can see also our Associate Dean Māori, Peter Robinson. Thank you so much for speaking on behalf of our manahuri. And here you can see Professor Paul Memmott speaking. Alison presenting a gift to our Naui canoe, to our school. Beautiful gift, so thank you. Our mihi, another mihi. I love the expressions of Professor Anthony Hoite there. Our ava, we had an ava ceremony, and this is historical because we've never really had this for our faculty, so it's awesome to do this with our international guests. And you can see here 2 of our PhD students, our newest Māori and Pacific PhD students, Vula Do'ofohe and Aria Roche, many thanks. We also had Pare Ihaka, who's also a PhD student of Lee's from planning, so very awesome. Great experience. And we've got our kaiarahi here, Wikuki Kingi, sharing his sacred waka curricula with us. This is ... watch this space. So, yeah, Anthony Hoite, Lena Henry also was part of our mihi. And then Alison spoke at Eila Hoite's class, School of Design. Eila Hoite is one of our newest Māori lecturers, and it was just awesome to hear Alison's work. This is their class. I feel like I need music with this. Look at Karamea here. Awesome engagement with Anthony Hoite and also Jeremy Treadwell. Paul had a great time with them, catching up on their work. Memeru research, which is about earthquake resilient whare all around Aotearoa. So this is awesome. ... Watch this space. Whale, we did a bit of touring, seeing our campus buildings, but also other sites around Tāmaki Makaurau. So Alison and Paul joined in Lama's studio, which is about Samoa, a brief in Samoa, cross-cultural sustainability, climate change. Awesome. And actually, the next night, Paul became an expert in climate change for Anthony's panel the next day. And so, mana whenua of Tāmaki Makaurau, it was awesome to be hosted around Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei by our Assistant Pro-Vice Chancellor, Māori, Michael Steadman. And again, awesome connections for Alison and Paul. And we could not pass. I'll hold back my tears. Riwi's house. It was great to show Riwi's abode. Today, this morning, Lama and Paul presented their research to the class, and Paul spoke about kinship groupings, about socio-spatial behaviours within camps, but also Australia as the country it is, many countries. And so, again, fantastic learnings for the students. And yeah, this is just showing more engagement at different levels. This is our kaiarahi Wikuki Kingi. So their time with us ends tonight with their public lectures for the Fast Forward 2023. Tonight we continue the theme of mana Moana, which acknowledges the ancestral connections across this great Pacific Ocean that connects us all. We continue with the ideas about indigenizing places, indigenizing design thinking, and going deep into time and space to understand lines of connection, lines of remembering, lines of knowing country. So we thank you all for joining us this evening. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'd like to pass it on to our Professor Lee Beattie, Head of School of Te Pare School of Architecture and Planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and awesome introduction, Lama and Charmaine. So I'd just like to give them a round of applause for all the work that those two guys have done, running this sort of stuff, and all the people that have helped them. So I'm not going to take too long. I just wanted to say and just where you sort of ended up was a really good point about where our place is in the Pacific and where we see ourselves here at the school. And I just wanted to acknowledge that one of our members has just left the school after 24 years, and it just showed where we sit as a school, being 106 years of being a school, and hopefully it will be a school for a lot longer than that. But that person was here, Ross was here for a quarter of our whole life of the school, which I think is an incredible thing. And I think as urban designers, urban planners and architects, that's what we're thinking about, the long view and what you're talking about. So bringing it back to what we're talking about tonight, which is really, really important, it's recovering from COVID. As I said the last time I had the privilege to kick off one of these lectures again, is about bringing us back face to face, bringing us back to who we are, bringing us back to what we are as a school, and bringing back our international guests, which you're the first ones we've managed to bring back since COVID, which is great to have our colleagues and lovely friends from across the ditch. It's always good to have those types of people here. So it's really great to have you here, really reinforce our place in the Pacific. Great to have our friends from across the ditch in Sydney who just start this process again about re-engaging with the world, and it's really important for us to do as a school. But now I have to do the most important thing in many ways, and that's introduce our sponsor, because without Jib, without Gordon and his team, we wouldn't be able to do any of this. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to our lovely sponsor, Jib, for all the support they give to the school. Do you have to do this thing?
I think you're overstating my my positiveness. I'll keep this very, very brief. I should put my cards on the table. My name's Gordon. I'm from Winstone Wallboards, and I do the marketing. So if you let me keep talking, I'll just keep going. So you've been warned. But on behalf of Winstones and Jib, firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. Purely from a selfish point of view, I've learned a lot from these sort of events of what's coming through, and being able to learn from such privileged people and distinguished people as yourselves. We really take a lot from it. So thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight, and thank you all for allowing us to be here tonight. That's pretty much all I'm going to say. We do have a little short video on the new manufacturing plant from Tauranga, which we always get a lot of questions on. So I'll step out of the way and let that go. And if there's any questions, just yell out.
Awesome, thank you, Gordon.
Thanks.
In 2023, Winstone Wallboards will open its new Jib plasterboard manufacturing and distribution facility in Tauriko, Tauranga. Tauranga is New Zealand's 5th largest city and is the fastest growing regional economy. It is New Zealand's fastest growing regional job market and home to the largest, most efficient port in the country. The new Winstone Wallboards plant will be based at the Tauriko Business Park, 10 kilometres from Tauranga City. It will be built on 12.8 hectares of land, making it 2.5 times bigger than the current site. Designed with sustainability at the forefront, this plant will be a significant step forward towards Fletcher Building's goal of reducing carbon emissions by 2030. The new plant will have extensive recycling capability on site for water and waste. It will also include new state-of-the-art technology and equipment, enabling the business to manufacture the full range of our Jib plasterboard products with a high degree of flexibility. Automated processes will also ensure increased enhancement of the safety and manufacturing processes. The new Winstone Wallboards facility reinforces our commitment to manufacturing in New Zealand, and we look forward to sharing this journey with you.
Let's give an applause for Jib.
Thank you, sponsor.
Thank you. All right. All right, so now it gives me a very great honour to introduce my mentor, kaumātua and friend, Professor Paul Memmott. Professor Paul Memmott is an anthropologist, architect, and for some decades has been the director of the Aboriginal Environments Research Centre, AERC, at the University of Queensland. In recent years, Paul has directed the Indigenous Design Place, an initiative which draws on interdisciplinary researchers across the university's faculties and engages with Indigenous clients and personnel. Paul's scholarship includes over 300 publications, including 11 books and monographs. And I would say the most significant would be Gunya Gundi Wurli, the Aboriginal architecture of Australia. And alongside that, with Professor Alison Page, they co-wrote Design Building on Country. Amazing books. In addition, 215 applied research reports and 40 competitive grants. He has supervised over 50 postgraduate and honours students, and he has won several prestigious teaching awards for Indigenous education. Now, to name a few of Paul's previous students, because some of you may know them, Dr. Tim O'Rourke, also one of my co-supervisors, the late Associate Professor Elizabeth Grant, Kevin O'Brien, the Aboriginal architect from Queensland, Professor Mark Moran, Dr. Kelly Grenop, Dr. Shanine Fanton from People Oriented Design, Dr. Ruth Faliolo, my sister, Dr. James Davidson, who's very much an expert in climate resilience in Queensland, Dr. Kathy Keys, Dr. Stephen Long, and the list goes on. And so really this is to demonstrate the excellence in teaching and excellence in pushing forward research about Indigenous communities in Australia and through myself in the Pacific. And so I'm one of the lucky students who had the privilege of completing a PhD with Professor Paul Memmott from 2012 to 2016. And Paul, I just want to say I grew so much as a researcher, as a writer, as an independent thinker, and for that I'm forever grateful. I'm also grateful to Professor Deidre Brown, who introduced us back in my master's, so thank you so much. So in 2021, Paul was awarded the Officer of the Order of Australia, AO, for distinguished services to ethno-architecture, anthropology, to Indigenous housing and cultural heritage, and to tertiary education, including co-founding the Aboriginal Data Archive in 1976. Paul, it's my great pleasure to host you here in Aotearoa, Waipapa Taumata. In a small way, this is to reciprocate your aroha, your support, ongoing mentorship, and all those opportunities you created for me since we met a decade ago. So, whakamalo lahi atu o whātu.
If you're not a big fan of lollies, Paul, I'll be glad to take that off your hands. Joining him tonight is Professor Alison Page, who is a Waipanga and Wari woman from Thawawal and Yuan, apologies if I'm mispronouncing these nations, and is an award-winning designer, artist and filmmaker who has been practicing since the late 90s, connecting First Nation stories and traditional knowledges to contemporary art, architecture, urban design, public art and film. She appeared for 8 years as a regular panelist on the ABC TV show, The New Inventors, in 2015, was inducted into the Design Institute of Australia's Hall of Fame, and last year won the Interior Design Excellence Awards Gold Medal. She is Associate Dean at the University of Technology's Design Architecture and Building School and the founder of the National Aboriginal Design Agency. Together they have written a best-selling book, Design Building Country, as mentioned, which explores Indigenous design, architecture and engineering principles as a blueprint for contemporary Australian design and architecture. And that is what they are here to share with us tonight. Thank you.
Please put your hands together for our speakers.
I was waiting for it. It's like the greatest gift I've ever been given. Thank you. I can't wear it. It's all right. I'm a designer. I can fix it. Oh, thank you. Second one she's made.
All right.
Darling. Thanks. Now make sure you go and sit up there and watch it.
This country is alive. It's a place of replenishment and knowledge and power. The Aboriginal connection to country is an intimate relationship built over tens of thousands of years that has permeated this land with the vibrations of countless dreams and stories. There is and never has been any real separation between people, animals, plants, earth, water or air. The trees, the rivers, the mountains, the sky, even the things we make and build, it is all part of country. And country is like a family member. Our cousins, aunties, our brothers and sisters. Country is where we all come from. We all breathe this country, and this country breathes us.
I'm a filmmaker, so I couldn't help myself but start with the film.
We'd like to acknowledge the country where we talk tonight. We'd like to acknowledge the elders from this country, past, present and future. We acknowledge Jip for putting on this event tonight, and we thank and honour the people who brought us here and who've shown us somewhere we can maybe extend our mana. I'm going to start talking first, and bear with us, because I'm not going to talk immediately about architecture. Alison will take that up in a little while. I also have to acknowledge all of the old people who taught me and who have passed away. Some of them were in that image you saw, which brought tears to my eye. Since 2007, I've been privileged to be teaching in an controlled Aboriginal-owned pre-vocational training school in Western Queensland on the Georgina River Basin, where I'm known as Kamara. And there are certain lessons I teach there to young Aboriginal people. I'm in charge of teaching the culture there. And the first thing the boss says is, "What? You're probably all wondering why there's a white fella teaching you culture." And he says, because the old people taught him and the old people have all passed away, and it's his job to give the culture back to us, Aboriginal people. And so I've taught like there about for 17 years, three intakes a year of up to 30 people. And there are certain things I'm privileged to teach there that I don't normally put out, but I've asked the leader of the group, Colin Saltmere Buller, for permission to do some talking from my lessons here tonight. So I'm going to start with an account of the dream time, and that's going to lay the foundation for what Alison's going to follow on with, and we'll both be joining in on that a little bit. So, and I'm going to ask Lama to help me just move this whiteboard forward. Maybe Lama will have to sit over there. In the beginning, when the land was soft and plastic, beings came out of the earth and they jumped up at making places all over the continent. Everywhere they jumped up, they sat and stood and looked around, and this was the beginning of the dream time, the dreaming. So we start with dream time in the past, and I'll move on to talking about it in the present, or in the what's called the ever when, with all the time dimensions folded into one. Some of them just stayed at their sites. Others travelled out a little bit, came back to their site, and still others went for long travels, making more sites across the continent. So in the belief system, we have to imagine that the whole of the continent is covered by these travel routes and sites. The ancestral beings left behind energies in these sites. Their energies infuse the sites, and their energies are believed to be perpetual energies, defying the Western laws of physics, of course. So they had adventures at these sites. They might have been minor little adventures. Sometimes they met another creature from the dream time and had an encounter. They might have had a fight. They might have exchanged things. They might have talked. They might have made love. One of might have got injured or killed. They also left parts of their bodies behind as they travelled, perhaps ribs or hair or body fluids, blood, semen. And they also left behind a name for each place they made. And they invariably made a song up for each site that they left behind. And in that song they encoded various things. They encoded usually something about what happened at the site to them. They also may have left behind a sacred object, what Pakawa call a Chiringa stone. And they also left behind ceremonies. So it's difficult for people to understand now that the whole continent is covered with these sites containing perpetual energies, even under the bitumen or the concrete of the cities. The belief system tells us that these sites are still there. This is Alison's also showing her map of Sydney that she will talk about in due course, and developing her sort of interpretation of this for that area. at a certain time in the ancient past, things changed. Because I should have said, but each of these ancestral beings it had human qualities, but it also had either part animal or part plant or part meteorological or part planetary. So we have kangaroo men, and we have emu women, and we have yam women, and we had python men. We had sun people, moon people, rain people. This is the rain dreaming on my shirt. And at this point in the past, there was a division where humans were born out of these places. And those humans kept something of the animal or plant in them. And the animals also, and plants and stars and things were born out of these places. And they kept something of the human qualities in them. And so today we find that there are descendants of these places, and they tend to be in clustered these sites, so that we have, we have these clusters of sites which belong to particular dreamings, or as anthropologists call them, totems. And so each one will be associated with a particular plant or animal or star. Might be the Seven Sisters or the Southern Cross. And these are what anthropologists call estates. And within each one is a descent group from the particular ancestral being in this area. What the anthropologists will call a clan, or often a patri clan. And those people are said to be descended from the dreaming. And so the whole continent was made up of these estates. And the ceremonies that were left behind, their responsibility was to perpetuate the ceremonies and songs for each of their countries. And the people here of the kangaroo dreaming, for example, their job was to perform the kangaroo ceremonies. And these were of the type that anthropologists call increase rituals or fertility rituals. And so, also I didn't mention that during the dream time, out of the ground sprung designs on the ground, and then sprung up onto the beings, sprung up onto their shields. And so these humans today, their responsibility is to create these sacred designs on the ground and reenact the ritual in the exact way that the ancestors left it. And so all of these groups then were charged with doing their ceremonies so that there was a balance in nature. If the emus weren't abundant in a particular year, the emu people would be blamed for not doing their ceremonies. And so on. The yam women would have to do their ceremonies. The rain people would have to do their ceremonies to bring the rain. And it was no good. These kangaroo men certainly couldn't go and do an emu ceremony because they did not have the emu's energy in them from the site, from the Jakurpa, the Aotearoa, the Angadalungwa, the Mimburi. These are the words for these energies in the sites in different languages. So this is the explanation as to why there weren't any Adolf Hitlers or Roman emperors or Genghis Khans taking over country and taking people's country. Authority was decentralised in these cults, in these totemic lodges, because only there could their ceremonies work. And hence there's no oral history of any great wars, of any great conquests in Aboriginal Australia over 60,000 years, which is quite remarkable. The exception was that if there was a travelling dreaming, just say for example, this was a rain dreaming, the rain people here, and there was another rain dreaming in this country, and there was a linking travel route, these rain people could join in with their ceremonies, although this group would lead them, and so on. So some of these travel lines went long distances across the continent, and that's what's Bruce Chatwin introduced this term, the song lines. And that's what it means. I think I've laid enough concepts now to give Alison a foot up, but I've got to just do one more thing, and I'm going to read an excerpt to give you a sense of what these songs were like. I'm going to read a translation of a series of songs from the southern Gulf of Carpentaria. And it's about a tiger shark. And one has to put oneself in the position of the singers. The singers are all of the tiger shark dreaming. And by singing the songs, they're singing in the present tense, but they're repeating the journey of the shark in the present, as if they are reenacting it as being real for the now. The shark and the singers become embodied together, they're one. And the shark's actions are once more brought into being by the cult members singing them. And so when I read this, you have to imagine it's men who are chanting songs over and over. The eye, the well of the tiger shark is there at Manangura. Manangura, it is there that the tiger shark climbed up singing. The shark was at the well singing, he was sending his song back to the country where he had travelled. We are naming the well Dungurumaji, my father's name. The tiger shark was at the well singing, and so it is we are singing the well Dungurumanji and the trees that surround it. And then we are singing the double-barred finches and the bar-shouldered doves that come to drink at the well. Onwards then, we are carrying the song, and we are singing the very tall cycad palms, which have as their personal name Yulunguri, that same name as the shark. And then we are singing the white-barked gum tree, which is named in the song as Garajiji, the same name as my father's brother. And we are singing northwards, and we descend down into the depths of the river, and we are singing the mouth of the shark. Down in the depths of the river we are singing, here we sing the bundle of soaking cycad nuts, and we follow the high tide when the current is flowing strongly downstream. We continue singing northwards, and then we are climbing up onto the riverbank. Onwards now, onwards, along the riverbank we are singing, and we're singing the tall steep sides of the eastern riverbank. It is the mainland, yes, we are still singing on the mainland. We are singing the camps for the old people, and we are singing the children who will not stop talking. We sing the bark canoes and the old man making the fishing net, the cycad bread and the footpaths along the top of the riverbank. And then onwards, 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 and northwards we follow the path of this song. In its fullness and completeness we are singing it, we are singing it. And so you get the sense of the poetry of the songs, even though that's very compressed. I'm going to let Alison take over.
So that's how you do site analysis in Aboriginal architecture in Australia. It all starts with story, and it all starts with songlines, and it all starts with those energies. And I think what you beautifully explained, Paul, was our law, and how our law was recorded, and how all of our science was recorded, was through these ancestral tracks that were laid down by these ancestral beings thousands of years ago. And as you pass through ceremony and law, so Aboriginal people didn't write anything down. So the way that we remembered all of the cultural and ecological and scientific data that you need to survive, like the average person would need to know everything there is to know about 400 plants. You know, when they flower, you know, that story there about the cycad and how you would prepare, you know, leach the poisons out of the nuts, you know, because how you said that, you know, in the chant, there is the reference to the bag in the bottom at the high tide, in the bottom of where the shark is.
Yes, I could have also... Is that on? I could have also talked about the shark then travelled and his stomach was full of these cycad nuts and he was vomiting out the nuts as he travelled along the coast for 1,000 kilometres. And these nuts then grew into groves of cycad trees, which are sacred sites. And he left behind that technology for people to use, for humans to use.
And so we, like many other cultures in the world, I think the Turkish have memory palaces. Aboriginal people encoded all of that data, all of that knowledge into stories. The more elaborate the stories, obviously the vomiting, you know, there's, you know, a bit of sex and, you know, great stories have elaborate chapters that can be remembered. Each one of those, quite often some of the characters will be plants or they'll turn into animals or they'll, like go back to some of the ancestral stories of being part plant, part animal, part human. And encoded in it, like as you get older and you pass through ceremony and law, the key to the code is unlocked to you. And so how you remember all of that data is by walking country, because those stories are embedded into geographic locations and into objects and into song and into dance and into the paintings that are on the cave walls, in the paintings in the sand, in the paintings on the body. So you are using multi-art form, and actually design really, to kind of continually reinforce the mnemonic, continually reinforcing not only that ecological and environmental data, but also social mores. You know, in that story, I love the reference to, you know, the kids who won't shut up. There'll be something in there that's also layering about how to maintain healthy communities.
Yeah, so this is going to understanding the cultural landscape. And when I was with Lamu students the other day, I was asking them, well, what's happening in the landscape around the building? They had little sense of anything. And today with Lamu students, we talked about the cultural landscape around Auckland and the importance of particular sites and mountains and islands and the canoe portal that Riwi taught me about it. And understanding that the sacred sites are only one of about 20 categories of types of sites that are in the Aboriginal geography and present in the cultural landscape. So Alison's talking about unpacking all of that in the interpretation of design and the positioning of a building or a landscape in a project.
Because these song lines are still very much a fabric of the part of Australia. That was something that the colonisers couldn't destroy. It's still very much there. So in a way, it's a really interesting sort of brief, I suppose, to the designers of geographic location and the designers of things, that what is your role in preserving and amplifying the song lines that are part of the fabric of Australia, the part of place. And so you see these lines, they're also calendars. So some of the stories, like there's another shark dreaming story from the Torres Strait that will tell you when a particular constellation is on the horizon. That means that this particular shark is breeding and you can see the oil on top of the water, but that will also tell you that the yam is ready to eat. And so over a period of 65,000 years, as the climate changed, and of course there was the Ice Age in that time, this web would have been this kind of moving system of remembering. And so the stories would have had to have changed and adapt. You know, and of course also stories would have also had major events. Like some of our dreaming stories we're starting to learn now are actually eyewitness accounts of major floods, volcanic eruptions. So there's some really interesting research going on in Australia around that.
Yeah, I talked this week about deep time and deep history, and the fact that in Australia now we have transdisciplinary researchers who are going back in time to try and understand how Aboriginal people adapted to these climate change events in the past, to help with what to do now and in the future. So there are secrets that can be unlocked through the oral histories combined with the archaeology, the linguistics, the geomorphology, and so on.
And that's why when, even in Sydney, this is my traditional land, so my ancestors were camping at the Opera House, where the Opera House is, in 1788 when the first fleet arrived. But, they have stories about this valley. It was a beautiful, when the sea was 50 kilometres further east, it was a beautiful valley with rivers running through it, and so some of those islands you can see would have been mountains. And so some of those song lines exist still in the sea. And in Arnhem Land, you'll still have fishermen who won't cross particular parts of the water because they still remember the boundaries that were there before the end of the Ice Age. So it's interesting now when we start to do site analysis. There's this Aboriginal architect, Craig Kerslake, and he's almost going out to NASA level sort of space when he's doing a site analysis right down to this tiny little site in the middle of Sydney. But why that's important is because all of the decisions that you make about how you might arrange a building, where you might put a window, where you might position people as they walk through this space will have everything to do with the songlines, everything to do with that sacred mountain that is 100 kilometres away, even though you can't see it. We still have to face it. We still have to honour it and make reference to it so that we're continuing this system of songlines.
This is the equivalent of the VAR in Aboriginal Australia. There are the energies pervade out from the sites, from the sacred sites. And so, if you're developing an area with a new building or a landscape, there's a need to sense and be aware of what is in that vicinity and how it's impacting and how you position and arrange in space and activate space in a meaningful way.
And Paul talked about these perpetual energies and how the ancestral energies ended up in plants, or the ancestors left behind body parts and they might become trees. Well, they become materials that end up in objects. And so in our philosophy, this is an image of a man, Frank Gramanamana. It's a beautiful film. If you ever go to Australia and you go to the National Museum of Australia, there's this beautiful film of this man making this fish trap. And he must have the responsibility of that particular fish trap the fish trap ancestor. And so when he's making the fish net and the trap, he's talking to the object like it is a person. So we have dialogue as we are walking around country like it is a family member, it is a living entity. So this idea, it was interesting you said before, it defies the laws of physics. Actually, a lot of Aboriginal philosophies actually have a lot more in common with quantum physics, because we think there is energy in everything, even the rock, or all the objects that we make and build have energies.
Think particle physics.
So, anyway, that's another lecture, which we're not going to do. But he's talking to the fish trap ancestor and he's saying, you made this water hole over here, and in that water hole I can get this type of fish at this time of year. And so the making of the object, the designing of the object and the making of the object is ceremonial. So the artist or the maker or the builder is simply a medium through which the ancestors are channeling themselves through. And so it's more than remembering. Like, remembering obviously is very, very important, but the object itself becomes energised, it becomes animated by country and by these perpetual energies. And so I think as designers, that's a very interesting concept for us to think about. It's a very interesting concept in relation to this kind of throwaway society we have around objects that, you know, I think you've got sort of IKEA at one end of the scale, and you've got, you know, this sort of idea of building preciousness into objects.
Yes, and I should have mentioned that the descendants of a particular area are close kin, not only with the dreamings, but with that country and the objects that come from that country. So people will call, I'll be driving along with old men, and somebody will say, brother, brother, and he'll be talking to a kangaroo going past. Go peacefully, brother. We are not here to harm you. We are here to protect you. And similarly with the country, people talk to the country all the time and address it as kin.
Paul gave the best lecture today on kinship and country and skin, and it's a whole mathematical, another mind-blowing system we haven't got time to get into now, but I think the takeaway really is the idea that you can't separate any part of nature. You can't separate, if you are designing for country and designing with country, you can't separate our ontology, our religious beliefs and our spirituality. That somehow, even in the middle of a hectic city like Sydney, and you know, I thought Sydney had the most building projects going on at the moment, but then I came to Auckland and I realised, wow, it's really hard to tune in to the ancestral beings here right now. But, you know, somehow we have to, as practitioners, kind of find a way to bring some of these concepts to life.
And we're talking here about identity, so understanding the identity of country, the identity of the totems, the descendants share that identity. How do we bring identity into projects and materials that we're using? This is an image from Gunya and Worley, and we're not going to go into Aboriginal architecture tonight, but it's all in that book. But we just put it up because it brings out this issue of positioning buildings on country. How do we do it?
And also that, you know, our nura, our home, like nura is one of the only words actually that is the same in all of the Australian Aboriginal languages. It means home. And so our concept of home is this broader area. So actually we didn't place that much kind of emphasis on, you know, the shelters that we kind of lived in. They were more like a second skin. They were lightweight, they were readily made of materials, they were extremely sustainable and very good for the climate, designed for the climate, you know, and as it adapted as well, and could be moved, which, you know, I don't know what it's like here, but there are certainly towns in Australia that are being so inundated by floods at the moment that, you know, this concept isn't looking so savage after all.
Country is home.
Country is home. So it's a very interesting idea that I think, you know, part of the existential crisis I think Australia is having around housing is that, and this obsession with housing, and I know New Zealand is equally obsessed with real estate as we are, but one of the core issues there is that people see home ownership as their only way of belonging. And so what we have to do, and part of the cultural inheritance of First Nations people to all people who come and live on their country, is to find out the stories of that land and find new ways to belong there. Find ceremony, find language, find song, find other ways to belong. Otherwise, we are all going to die. So it's becoming sort of like not a nice to have, but a must have. Because this isn't good. You know, this bringing kind of these transplanted architectural styles from England and America. And as Robin Boyd called it, you know, in the 1960s, he wrote The Australian Ugliness and said, you know, Australia has to stop being second-hand England or second-hand America. You know, we have to find our own identity, and the identity has to grow from place, because this is not only embodying Western values, but it's just not good for the climate in any way, shape or form, and neither are the landscapes that come along with them. So when in Australia at the moment, we're re-looking at placemaking. So in New South Wales, one of the colleagues that I started working with, and we were all mentored by Paul. So Dylan Combermary was Australia's first Aboriginal architect. He has been working in the Government Architect's Office where we all started our careers in the 90s. He stayed there, and he's actually convinced the state government to pass a planning law that for any state significant projects, the developers and the landowners have to demonstrate how they are connecting with country, how they are co-designing with the traditional owners, how they are looking after the land, the sea and the sky, as if it is a family member, and they have to demonstrate how they are enhancing the story of country and inviting the traditional owners to curate the entire city like it is a museum, because the landscape is our museum, right? So we need to curate each site in the same way that it was curated thousands of years ago. This story should be told here. This story should be told there.
And following from that, at least 3 universities have now published their strategic planning for country, for building on country, which follow the same way. But even that's just the vanguard of the tsunami of change that's been happening. Alison and I are on a thing called the First Nations Advisory Committee to the Australian Institute of Architects. It's predominantly Aboriginal architects and designers. There's 1 or 2 white people who have been privileged to join it, which is myself as co-chair. And one of our first jobs was to advise the Architects Accreditation Council of Australia about 6 new competencies required for architects around building on country and engaging with communities, local communities. And those 6 new competencies have been accepted by all boards of architects in Australia and will be now part of the board exam to become a registered architect. And in turn, those requirements are filtering now into the school curricula, because to get accreditation as a school curricula, you have to be able to show that you're teaching the material that's required for the board exam. So this is causing an amazing tsunami of change in Australia, and all of the architectural firms are suddenly ringing the poor 15 or so members of our committee saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And we're very busy producing new acumen professional practice notes and trying to set up fast learning curves for these firms to engage with local communities and carry out co-design processes with them in their new projects, particularly public works.
So, you know, it's a little bit like when the sustainability laws came in and the industry shit itself and then actually just started scrambling to get experts in to kind of help each of these firms. The black design movement is in the same space at the moment. And so we have a bit of a problem in the sense that we don't have enough Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practitioners. We are kind of bringing together, I mean, now on architectural teams, you'll have marine scientists, you'll have fire management experts. I mean, and this is interesting because the imperative, funnily enough, for this to be passed by the landowners, by the government, and for developers to sign up to it as well, they have to, if they want to get the planning across the line, and the architecture firms have to do it, otherwise they're not going to win the competition. So it's not law, but it's kind of a movement in the sense that, you know, it has to be done. But it's come from major fires and major floods that are happening, like it's serious. And so, you know, I think the cost of not doing it is starting to dawn on these landowners. And so these relationships between the landowners and the traditional owners is kind of to invite people to culturally govern these places again as they were for 65,000 years is refreshing.
Do we have to have a break soon?
Hey?
5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just going to show just a few projects. I mean, there are Aboriginal architecture projects going on around the country. I won't go into them because each architect has their own approach. This was a building, an extension of a Wilcannia hospital, and what was good about it was the community, you know, became the project managers. They actually made an incorporated entity. They built the hospital out of stabilised earth bricks, so they started a social enterprise. They employed, I think, 10 Aboriginal builders as part of the project. You know, there was more than just bricks and mortar delivered, but also it was embedded with all of the cultural stories about their totem, the river cod, Pare, the river cod. In my land, back to my land, you know, a lot of what I do on day one of a project is go back to old maps and try and find what country was like before somebody came along and blew it up. What happened here at Barangaroo was the shipping industry just came and blew up one of the best headlands. It was the highest point of the harbour and right next to the deepest part of the harbour, so it's the best fishing. And this was a place that we now call Barangaroo. But part of that was about reinstating the original shoreline, you know, building artificial reefs so that you can bring the marine life back, planting the endemic species, doing all sorts of ceremony and art projects to kind of bring at least some of the life back to this site. And we call it rematriating country because, like when we repatriate objects, we're bringing this culture back to the people. I mean, and it takes an act of will because obviously it's huge amounts of money. So without that law, without that regulation, the planning guide, we wouldn't be able to kind of force these big developers to do this work. I'm working at the moment on a development called the Bays West redevelopment. It's on Sydney Harbour as well. Paul talked about increased sites. This site was an old coal power station, and we realised very quickly in this working part of it was a working port, that there was an endangered white seahorse. There's literally only like a small number of them left. And so we thought, how do we create a contemporary increased site in the context of a large development where there's a new railway line and there's a new school and there's multiple apartment buildings, there's going to be a large-scale cultural institution on the site. And so, you know, when we're in these meetings, you know, there must be 40 or 50 consultants, but they're all working to save the white seahorse. So what we're going to do is, with the landscape architects, is throughout the public space, we are building these channels where the high tide of the harbour can actually wash through these channels and be cleaned by salt marsh. So at least 12 hours every day, the site sort of just breathes in and out this salt water. We found an old creek that was incarcerated in a drain. So we're releasing the fresh water there and doing what we can to clean the fresh water. And then we're building these, you know, we found out that the favourite habitat, when we're working with marine scientists, it's just the favourite habitat of these seed horses was abandoned shopping trolleys that people had thrown in Sydney Harbour. And so we're getting artists, inviting artists to come and make motels that we'll pin to the wall of the harbour in order to create, you know, happy places for them to breed. And then we'll do, and this is the most important part, we'll bring in the creatives and the people with the activation budgets to come along and do seahorse ceremonies. So that becomes the identity of that place. It's nothing like how potent and spiritually potent this was, but at least it's in the terms of a contemporary context with all of the pressures of planning and heritage and everything else that we have to kind of fight. You know, this is how we're trying to reinstate this cultural landscape in the city. Just some of the things that we're also looking at is truth-telling, because there was, you know, stuff happened. This is the site where Captain Cook landed, and this was where my people met Captain Cook. My people thought that he was a reincarnation of their totem which had died, and that was the whale. And so I made a sculpture that was both the ribs of the whale and the bones of the ship. Because in Australia, you know, history is got two perspectives. It's a shared history, and there's two different ways of looking at all of these monuments. And so we're playing around a lot with those bronze statues. And then building this ceremony. So I can't go into this because we don't have time, but one of the projects I'm working on in the middle of the city is about looking at all the landscaping around those original colonial buildings that were built on Macquarie Street. That's, you know, the Mint, the barracks, the Parliament, State Library. This is what Governor Macquarie wanted to build to show that Australia was a civilised society. So we're looking at, you know, ways in which we can kind of do those connections to the cultural landscape, as Paul talked about. We're looking at where the water wants to flow, what the plants want to do, how we can open up the ground and plant endemic species. But also we'll probably plant the huge parkland next to it with native grasses and burn it every year in a ceremony that actually washes smoke over these colonial buildings.
Smoke the buildings.
Yes, smoke the buildings. But really, ultimately, this all comes down to engagement with community, and there's a whole nother 2-hour lecture on that, which I won't go into, but we're figuring out all of these different ways of engaging with community. Nobody is staying in their lane in terms of, well, I'm an architect, so I don't have to talk to this person over here, because we're seeing the most transdisciplinary practice I think the industry's ever seen, which is really exciting. But we're hoping that in some way it will kind of lead to an Australian design that is as old as it is, which is 65,000 years old.
And a new identity. So we'll have a little break now, I think.
Please give a hand for our speakers. Wonderful. Thank you. So hold those questions, those thoughts in your mind. We'd love you to have a little brief break, 5 minutes. There's some drinks outside. Have a drink, come back in. We'd like to start at 5 to 7, okay? And we'll begin our discussion. Thank you.
I thought the presentation had been absolutely mind-blowing and very relatable in terms of, I guess, my opinion, and I know many of you as well. Really, really great to see some of our young people here, our students, because I want you guys to have a voice tonight. And we've got these two knowledge holders, these two experts that would really love to share what they know. Anyways, I've just been scribbling the shit out of this book since I received it. And I spoke to us earlier about how relatable it was. And I know Deirdre knows my work very well. And so does Mike and Prof and Anthony Huete and Associate Prof Mike Davis. So I haven't been able to kind of put this down, kind of leading up to these guys coming. So, but I'm going to fire a question over to Professor Alison and then over to Paul, and then one each, and then we'll open the floor out to anybody, especially young people also. Okay, so I took a paragraph and I thought that we could possibly elaborate further on this word country. So it goes like this. In the Indigenous worldview, country means a way of seeing the world. Everything is living. There is no separation between people and nature. It is multidimensional and extends beyond the ground. There is sea, land, and sky country. As anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose wrote, people talk about country in the same way that they would talk about a person. They speak to country, sing to country, visit country, worry about country, feel sorry for country, and long for country. Country has dreaming origins and a future. The term attempts to encapsulate a sophisticated spiritual connection that Indigenous people have with the land that extends beyond ecology and includes songs, stories, and kinship relationships. Alison.
Yeah, country, we actually capitalise it with a C when we talk about country, and I think Paul probably explained country better than I've ever heard it before, and in such a deep and meaningful way. But it's interesting that, we go back to colonisation, and when Cook arrived, he brought with him in 1770 a scientific voyage. And so in a way, I think about the invasion of our country, and I think one of the most insidious things that invaded with Cook and the ship was Western science and this kind of taxonomic classification of nature. So suddenly all of these different ologies became separated, the stars and the weather and, just the study of plants and the study of animals, all of it became separated. And then that itself has been, we were talking about it the other night, and we were just sort of saying it's like some of the mess that is created just by that one thing alone is like this hideous fishing line that's just been tangled up that we've just been trying to unravel. And then the thing that's, that we talked about tonight, which is part of country as well, is storytelling and ceremony. And so the concept to the Western mind, the concept of including storytelling in science, in having narrative medicines and or things like that, are just things that are just too much of a stretch, I think. So in a way, it's interesting. I look at my practice over the last 25 years and I think, well, I'm a filmmaker, I do public art, I do urban design. Like, there's nothing in what I have done in the last 25 years that is about staying in a box just because I studied what I studied at uni. But it makes practice really exciting. It's amazing, actually. And we were talking this morning about that shark story. And I said to Paul, well, I'm sure there must be something about the time of year that the cycad nut, comes into flower. Ripens, related to the breeding patterns of the tiger shark. There will be. No one's done that research yet, but, to me that's actually such an interesting idea about country being this multi-dimensional relationship between humans and nature, and it goes beyond that. It includes all of our spirituality, and to me, I think that's a gift that all Indigenous people have to give to non-Indigenous people.
Can I just add to that about missing country or grieving for country? Just quickly read an excerpt from Stralo's writing. A group of honey ant men leaves its old home at Liaba and goes on a long journey west to Papunya, another honey ant, to Temik Centre, situated in Gugaja country. For a time they march along the edge of the foothills, fringing the western McDonald Ranges, and finally they come to a curve in the low-flanking range, and they know that Liaba will hereafter be hidden from their view. So they have for a moment a glance back towards Liaba. They see the pale purple peaks which surround it, gleaming dim through the fast-gathering haze. Like a pall of smoke, the haze enfolds the hills, and the men grieve for the home, which none of them expects to see again, and tears fall from their eyes, and their last chant goes up. Enfolded by plains lies Liaba. Beyond the far horizon lies Liaba. Enfolded by plains lies Liaba. Dimmed by the enveloping mists. And they sing that over and over again. But that's longing for home, grieving for country.
That's beautiful, Paul. And I've never heard of narrative healing, which is, really fantastic.
Well, you're the one who has proverbs and translating them to design, so we're giving you a few to take.
All right, this one's to Paul, and if you want to elaborate or add further as well, Alison. Paul wrote this paragraph in part of his book here. Australian Aboriginal architecture can therefore be defined as architecture that is selected, arranged, and constructed configuration of environmental properties, both natural and artificial, in and around one or more activity spaces, combined with patterns of behavioural rules and meanings to result in human comfort and quality of lifestyle. This definition includes selected environmental features, mental and behavioural rules, spatial properties, hearths and artefacts. It can also include buildings, but they are not necessary. It incorporates such concepts as spatial, settlement structure, avoidance behaviour, diversity of construction, detailing, and its impact on spatial experience and ceremonial spaces, imbued with meaning and theatrical moment. You don't have to answer that.
Well, we said before that house isn't home in Aboriginal constructs, and architecture isn't buildings, it's place in Aboriginal construct. And that the penny clicked after, like, doing a lot of field trips with old men working on land rights claims. And the oldest man, my big brother through skin, Paddy Woodman, at first, well, his younger brother used to advise me, and then he died, and then I put the older brother in the back of the Toyota, and he didn't say anything, and we're going through country, and I'm saying, is there a sacred site here? No, all the young men are saying, keep going, we've got more to go, you know. And then I'd say, but after a long time I realised that old Paddy's sitting in the back, but he was talking sign language to the young men. It wasn't their knowledge, it was his knowledge. He died at the age of about 110. In the evening I'd say, where are we going to camp? Because we'd just be camping in the open in swags and making fires. I'd say, here's a good place, it's getting dark. Paddy would go. And then we'd go a bit further and I'd say, Paddy, I'm hungry, it's getting late, it's getting dark, there's firewood there, look. And we'd keep going until he saw a place that was the right place. And it was always a grove of gidgee trees. And in the gidgee groves, they have a lot of needles falling down, and they can easily be swept aside so that you've got soft sand, and you can observe tracks of snakes or centipedes and have some degree of safety like that. The wood of the tree burns very well. You can burn it without ash, so you can make hot coals with no ash, which means you can put a steak on top of the coals and cook it, and then eat it with your hand and have no charcoal or ash in your mouth. And then in the morning you can wake up with these birds in the trees, and all night you can have the wind blowing in these leaves, giving you this sound. And as soon as the young men had got the firewood and we sat around the fire, Paddy would recite the country. Reciting the country means telling everything in the cultural landscape, calling the names of the ancestral beings, explaining what happened there and what happened there and where we are. and calling out to the country and telling them we're here and to keep us safe. And then going into the contact history and what happened in revolver time, the time of colonisation that Alison was talking about, and people were getting killed and having to flee. All of that gets packed into the evening as these steaks cook on the coals. And if it rained, we'd get a tarp out of the car and put it over the top of one of these trees to make a roof. And the young men would dig a drainage drain around the side, and we'd be all sleeping under the tree with a tarp over the top, and with a fire, perfectly warm and out of the rain. And that was what was positioning on country. That was, suddenly I realised that's architecture. And it's comfort, it's knowing how to establish comfort with the minimal, but in the right place and in the right cultural landscape.
And it's about understanding function. So from an Aboriginal perspective, is beyond the comfort of surface, the vegetation, the position of the sun, the prevailing winds. All of that is important, of course, but there is this more intangible dimension, this locational principle, which, while the young men were designing the windbreaks and the beds and, you know, the old man would be reciting country. And so there's a whole chapter in the book about how that can be a blueprint for urban design, for designing a city square. You know, like, why not? Or designing a great public space, a meeting place. You know, there are principles within the design of those Aotearoa camps that you can use to make contemporary architecture. Because, of course, you know, we're never starting with a greenfield site. We're never, you know, we have to sort of undo a lot of shit in a lot of places. But there's also that contemporary layer of history as well that needs to be acknowledged, because even within our culture, as new materials came in, stories were adapted and changed to accommodate those new materials. Rules were changed to accommodate the new materials. You know, and also there were new stories created to tell those historical references. So in a way, it's all there in terms of how would you approach it if you get approached to do a school in, you know, this place over here. You know, the ingredients and the essence of intent is there, and that's what architecture is. It's beyond the walls and the roofs, and, you know.
Who's got a question?
I'm going to sneaky, and I'm just going to Paul Liwi Thompson, and he's a very good friend of yours.
He was.
What was it like working with Paul?
It's not a great look for me, sorry.
Well, I'm a bit too emotional to talk easy about that, but Deirdre's here, and she introduced me to Riwi, and we struck it off together, and he taught me all I know, a lot of what I know about Māori culture and places in Auckland, and he took me to Orokai and to the marae and all the other Pares, etc., around the place, and he allowed me then to bring my students here, and he gave them design assignments here to bring out, to, you know, teach them about cultural knowledge of Māori people. And then he and Deirdre took students back to Brisbane, and we reciprocated. And Deirdre and I sat down with him, and Deirdre wanted to know how she could set up some equivalent of our research centre in Auckland, and that's when Riwi thought of the name Te Pare, which is to do with the entrance to the marae, and can mean different things: the threshold, the liminal space, the lintel, the stepping into the sacred space, all of those things. And he, because of his love of rugby union, he was regularly coming to, you know, Sydney and Brisbane for tests and that, and he took And I introduced him to the youngest Aboriginal architecture students.
You introduced him to us.
Yeah, and he mentored them while Deirdre and him arranged me to contact Bill Royal and Pare Royal and learn about Fortuna Chapel by John Scott and understand the history of Indigenous architecture in New Zealand, which was a generation ahead of the Indigenous architecture amongst the young people in Australia. And they all loved him at that time, and he was their mentor, and then suddenly he was taken away from us.
Thanks, Paul. We will now open it up to the floor. We've got budding architects here and students alike. So if anybody got a question or questions for our guests here, and now will be a perfect time. And then I'll give it to Charmaine to...
I should have mentioned Mike in that formula too. Mike was very heavily involved in those years.
Just acknowledging our kaumatua, Mike Austin as well. Sorry, Mike. Does anybody have questions, or young or old?
Hi, I'm Andrew Barry. I've been looking, Paul, at your book, and one of the things that's really kind of startling for a Kiwi looking at that book is how slight the architecture is. You know, with the kind of shelters and windbreaks. You know, to a kind of Western perspective, even to a kind of with an understanding of Māori architecture. There's not very much stuff, and so I'm wonder if you could talk more about how you've been able to kind of draw that knowledge forward, because I imagine a lot of it's been erased. It's one of the things, lots of our understanding of kind of early Māori architecture just relies essentially on kind of archaeology, and so that it must have been even kind of harder.
Well, in Gunya, I'm not sure which book you're talking about, but in Gunya, Gundi and Worley, I clearly define the fact that I've only started the research. There's a lot more research to do in different regions. Every region in Australia, I concluded, had a regional repertoire of shelters that were used. People were mobile within their territories, or in those clan estates that I described. People knew all that country. They moved around it the whole time, and then they moved into neighbours' countries. And when they were moving, they didn't need, really sedentary shelters. But what I identified in the book clearly was where there was inclement weather for long periods of time and good resources, then more sedentary or semi-sedentary architecture evolved. And so if we look at we're in Auckland. Your weather here is similar to the west coast of Tasmania, all those fronts that come across, and the southwest of Western Australia and the west of Victoria. All that's in those, those southerly winds coming around, screaming around the bottom of the globe, and that's where we find the sedentary Aboriginal architecture. And there we can find like cladding, up to 3 or 4 cladding layers, and the stone walls of the Gunditjmara people. And the use of the mud thatching and lining with feathers and things. So, and then again, there are other areas where there was more semi-sedentary architecture, like the rainforest in northeast Queensland, where there was heavy rainfall in the old weather patterns through the wet season, and people would then be sheltering inside for weeks on end, and that's when the shelter roofs went higher, because people needed to stand up inside the shelters. And the image that Alison showed was intersecting domes, so people developed technology out of lawyer canes to make intersecting dome structures, which allowed numerous house families to live in the one extended shelter and be able to socially interact out of the rain. So all those patterns are in place.
But there's sort of two things I think are big factors. Was one, we had to abandon 80% of the land mass to survive climate, like the Ice Age. Like 80%. So, you know, I just don't think they could really afford to not have adaptation inherently built and flexibility inherently built into their architecture. So, and, you know, and it also helped on a day-to-day basis too with just going where the food was. And also managing, you know, there's amazing systems of managing food source, you know, like we've hunted too much in this area, let's move over here, that kind of thing. And the climate calendar, because it changed, right? So, and then the second thing is that you know, I look at the marae and, you know, we were at, yesterday, and, you know, there's heavy ceremonial, like once you start building that kind of heavy kind of ceremonial elements into buildings, then you're not going to get rid of them, are you? Right? Because, and, you know, and I think there's a sort of, we had a lot of ceremonial places, but our ceremonial places were, a lot of them were ephemeral. You know, we would spend weeks on end making elaborate sand paintings that would be danced on and destroyed. We'd spend weeks on end making incredible headdresses that would ultimately just, you know, decompose or burn, you know? So we never kind of, I suppose, combined the two, really. But that's not saying that those places weren't sacred, and we didn't have sacred poles. We had sacred, you know, I suppose if you look at the evidence now of our occupation in terms of cave walls that had paintings, very elaborate paintings on them, those were almost our churches, if you like.
In my book, there's a chapter on meaning in Aboriginal architecture, and I say that the most elaborate meanings were in ceremonial architecture, but it was destroyed after the ceremony. The most energy was put into that. People, the hunter-gatherer life actually allowed people a lot of recreational time and time to do, you know, religious practices. So, unfortunately, but we're not allowed to talk too much about what was in a lot of those ceremonies. So I haven't written a book on that yet. There are photographs available if you want to look for them.
Yeah, but but I think that's you know, that's why I think we were considered savages, because we didn't have an architecture or an agriculture that was obvious. I think that's why you got a treaty here and we didn't.
And there's a big debate about this. I don't know whether you've heard of it here, the dark emu debate.
That we had an agriculture,
yeah.
but it was so, and we had an architecture, but it was so sustainable or slight in your words that it was, they just couldn't see it. Yeah. And so we were considered, you know, savages. That you know, and in fact, when we actually look at how sustainable it was, in terms of, you know, native grasses, apparently our grain belt was 5 times the size of the Australian wheat belt is now. You know, no irrigation, no pesticides, the soils were so aerated, there was nothing on this wide brown land. I mean, that's ridiculous. Yeah, there was this mosaic burning, which, you know, will now be exporting to South America, to probably Hawaii now, I would say. That these knowledges were so sophisticated that, in fact, you know, we were quite advanced. But, you know, unfortunately, we still don't have any rights. And, in fact, we're going to a referendum in, you know, a few weeks' time for an advisory group to government, and it's probably going to be a no vote from the Australian people.
And the news people on New Zealand TV this morning were shocked and horrified about the attitude of the Australian public. It was so mean to not recognise Aboriginal rights, because it's taken for granted here.
Kia ora korua. Ngā mihi kia koe, Prof Alison, for that kororo. And you've just pipped me. I had a question relating, in a few weeks' time, Australia's going to a referendum, and I'll just read out the question, that a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? And as somebody who was lucky enough last week to be on country in Bangaroo, the popular media indicators which I saw suggested that the answer to that referendum was going to be a no. And I just wondered if you could reflect on the contemporary Australian psyche, which is going to lead to a refutal. Can you speak to that? Or speak more to that space?
I had a couple of glasses of wine now, so just hold me back. Hold me back, because I've been involved in Conrec for like 10 years, right? And there has been this amazing, since the 1990s, this amazing movement of reconciliation in Australia, right? And which actually, that is, the things we were talking about tonight around these planning laws and everything, it's because of that reconciliation movement. It's because all of these, so we had this body established called Reconciliation Australia. They got all of these big companies to sign up to that. Those companies have these reconciliation action plans which force all of their workers to do cultural awareness training, right? That forces them. So, you know, Karen and Darren and Sharon that live in Queensland, and it just, from a long line of bloody racists, have to sit in a room and listen to some of the stuff we talked about tonight. But they come out of it and they're like, oh, that's all right, isn't it? You know, I don't mind that. Or they actually learn about some of the White Australia policies, and they also learn that, you know what? It's not the Australian people's fault what happened to Aboriginal people. It's England's fault. No one is like pointing to the real enemy here. You know, the people who actually brought smallpox over and created the most beautiful jail on earth. And sometimes when I'm fishing up in Arnhem Land, I think the joke's on England. Because the place is so beautiful, you know? And I think Australians just have to realise that no one's blaming them. It's just about actually, I mean, I really honestly think there were 3 parts to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which this referendum has come from. And one of them is about the voice, which is about basically an advisory group, you know, to tell the government how to do things better in Aboriginal communities because they've failed for so long. The second part was about truth-telling, and it's about actually uncovering some of this uncomfortable history. And the third part is treaty. I mean, I think they should have started with truth-telling, because once we actually start delving into that history, who would ever say no? What heartless bastard would ever say no? Because also, too, we'd realise that it's not... I think that the right-wing sort of Liberal Party in Australia have always played that card of the black armband view of history, you know, like you're just blaming us. And so Karen and Darren and Sharon just start to get their back up and just go, well, it's not my fault. I didn't come over on the first flight, you know. And so, you know, like it just causes this issue and they play on it, you know. And I think it's part of the sort of last-ditch, white-knuckled kind of grab-it sort of, you know, power for them. But it will be a blow to... Australia will not be the same the day after the referendum. In a way, it'll be interesting. I think that age of reconciliation, if it fails, the age of reconciliation will be over. But being a prisoner of hope, I am looking at the bright side of that, because Malcolm X says that once you're begging for your rights, you're never going to be free. And all Aboriginal people have done in the last 250 years is beg. And I'm sick of it. You know, I'm fucking sick of it. And so I'll be out on the streets. I used to be one of the most diplomatic people on earth, but I won't be after that. And I think a lot of white Australians will be angry too. And we'll actually just go, you know what? No, we're not going to be nice anymore. It's actually the age of reckoning.
Kia ora. All right. Oh, okay, great. Well, time is short. Just as we move the mic over to our colleague here, I understand there's a number of students here, and would it be amiss to miss a question for them? So, 1st of July, laws changed about citizenship in Australia, right? So, there's bound to be a flurry, a tsunami of New Zealand architectural graduates heading over to Australia. Okay, money's good, registration slightly easier. But this is the question, one sentence. What would you say, advise our rangatahi, our New Zealand architectural graduates about understanding country and really, really, really being sincere about how they design with and for country? One sentence.
Build a relationship with community. I only work in my wata, I only work in my land. But that's because it takes a really long time to build those relationships and to build that cultural authority.
You're talking about in Australia or New Zealand?
New Zealand, Kiwi.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of marae here. There's places of knowledge. Very important. One message we've put tonight is to understand your own cultural landscape, understand your own culture.
Your own prejudices.
And your own prejudices. Decolonise yourself.
Well, thanks very much for coming to speak to us today. I'm fascinated by the idea of shared history, one that has spanned 6,500 years. It's very much informed by the land and defined by country, and the other one, which is, even in the span of one generation, iterated and reiterated. So, in this sort of reconciliation, I'm curious to what do you both envision the new Australian design to be, and how can that help us create the story together, rather than a shared story that might be uncomfortable?
You said 6,500, 65,000.
Yes, excuse me, 6,500.
Well, the new Australian design is a process at this stage. And so what we understand it to be is what we've outlined is all parties, including the corporate bodies, the clients, the money holders, going through a process of understanding about the need to reset the compass on Australian identity and to engage with Aboriginal communities and country. But there's the last paragraph in our book sums it up, and Alison wrote that. She said, I can tell her she's going to read it.
I'm not, because I haven't got my glasses. You read it? Paul read it.
I flagged it for Lama to read. There is a new awakening fueled by ecological necessity to redesign our future and the relationship that we as people have with nature and each other. We can design our built environments to be a part of the managed landscapes that form the basis of First Nations ecologies since time immemorial. Our objects, interiors and places can be an extension of the songlines that crisscross this country in every direction and are a web of knowledge embedded in our everyday lives. This new Australian design will improve the well-being of people and create places that ultimately mean more to all of us. It will extend country, not abrogate it, and it should be created with that in mind because we are all connected to country.
Thank you.
But it brings to mind the senior man, whoever he was, that we saw in the Auckland Museum with a class of 10-year-olds with a map of the migrations through the Pacific to Aotearoa and asking the children, where did the people come from? Who were they? When did it happen? All of these questions about their identity, and the surprise, and they all answered the questions. They were clever students, yeah. So it's bringing that education right back down to preschool level, and changing the mind attitudes of people.
Well, we're starting to look at designing schools now and songwriting them, so we can embed the curriculum into schools, so people are actually walking around. We're walking spatially and learning.
Right, I've just been given a nod by my A+ student, so I've got to give him the mic. Just very, very quick question, and then we'll get on to the next part of our program.
Kia ora, te lava. I'm Tis. My question comes around from learning Māori and Pacific design, of course, that we've been doing here. And I heard you talk about the term va. For your architecture and culture, what does the term va mean? And also, how does it integrate into your architecture?
I'm still learning about what va means. I did examine Albert Rafiti's thesis, so I have a bit of an idea, his PhD thesis. And I've had conversations with Lama about this, but va is the breathing of space, the activation of space, the spirit of space, and being able to recognise that and or come to learn to perceive it. And I'm not sort of knowledgeable enough to talk about how Pacifica people do that. I tried to offer an explanation as to how Aboriginal people might do that, and the best way I can offer it is through an understanding of the cultural landscape, and it's what we've been talking about tonight. It's old Paddy reciting the country. It's knowing the places in the environment. It's knowing the meaning of the environment, or the meaning of the places in the environment as a total collection of places, including habitation places, resource places, dispute resolution places, ceremonial places, body disposal places, all of those and many more. You can rattle off the number. And understanding how it all fits together and how it activates mental space, cognitive space, and brings life into the country. But it's also overlaid with having the belief in the energies permeating from the sacred sites that extend out from those sacred sites. As an anthropologist who's been paid to go and record sacred sites for the government, most of them have site Protection Acts and statutory legislation. You're asked to put a boundary around a sacred site. So the question becomes, well, what's the sphere of influence of the site? How far does the site go? How far does its energy permeate? And you've got a bunch of traditional owners there. It's a very hard question. So we're going to put a line around it. But
it relates to time. So, what Paul's talking about is deep time relationship that affects the sort of va between people. But if you're going to create a meeting place between people, you use fire. Like in our culture, fire is healing, fire is everything, fire is energy. So I could create the most sacred place on earth just by putting a fire right there between Paul and I. So that becomes the kind of everyday animator of energy.
I made a joke before about particle physics, but I think we're in a time, or you young people are in a time when we're moving back to particle physics. When I was a young fella, we had protons and neutrons and electrons, and now I think there's 22 or 24 particles that they know about. So actually, even physics now supports the idea that there are particles flowing around here through my body, passing through my body, and they're permeating cosmic energies, and which brings us back to all of the ancient religions of the world and the big question about who are we and where are we going, where do we come from. Good point to end the discussion.
That's really, really awesome. On behalf of Te Pare, the School of Architecture and Planning, also our professors, our Dean Nola, our Associate Dean Deirdre Brown, our knowledge holders here, Paul and Alison, it's just been mind-blowing to hear you speak and to provide us your insights. And obviously these insights go 65,000 years, and it's really encouraging to know that you guys are digging this back up. I can only give you a couple of proverbs in terms of this narrative healing. Fa e mo pel fetua tautai a olua, which means may the navigator's star shine bright on the endeavours that you have in front of you, especially pushing these issues for the better of country. And also, whatonu whalau pea wahalenga I lumanga I o tātou tangata, Australia. May you blow the wind into the sails of your waka or your va'a as you navigate through that space as well. So just really awesome and mind-blowing stuff. So I just want to maybe give a hand to Professor. On behalf of...
Thank you for having us.
On behalf of Te Pare School of Architecture and Planning, we've just got a couple of gifts here for you both. That's for you, Alison. A memory of our kava bowl. Sorry, it's a bit small. You had about 12 of those cups yesterday, by the way. I wasn't counting. Paul, we've just noticed that our Kaumatua Lewi's book just came out. It's fresh off the press. And that's from Charmaine and I to you. We know that you guys had created a whakawhanaungatanga, your brotherhood, and we know that you'll enjoy that as well.
Here's the book.
All right. On that note, I'll hand over to Charmaine and she'll finish us off with karakia.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Thank you for staying a little bit late. We are sorry about that. We also want to thank JIB, our sponsor, but also the Walter Linton Foundation for funding the International Visiting Program at Te Pare School of Architecture and Planning. So, without further ado, let's all etu, and we're going to say the karakia together. Tu tawa mai I runga, tu tawa mai I raro, tu tawa mai I roto, tu tawa mai I waho, kia tau ai, te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa. Haumie, huie, takie. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. We do have the last fast forward lecture, October 4th, so watch out for that too, okay? Blessings.